Winning an auction can be the single worst thing that happens to you that year, and almost nobody realizes it in the moment they win. This is the winner's curse. Economists first spotted it clearly in oil drilling auctions back in the 1950s, in a setting that turned out to be the perfect natural experiment for the problem. Multiple companies would bid on the rights to the same untested patch of ocean floor, each one trying to estimate how much oil actually sat underneath it. Nobody knew the true value going in. That was the entire point of the auction existing in the first place. Every bidder had to guess, using their own geological surveys, their own models, their own internal confidence. The winner, by definition, was simply whichever company guessed highest. And here's the part that took economists a while to fully articulate. That highest guess was almost always too high. Not because the winning company was worse at estimating than everyone else, but purely because of what winning an auction under uncertainty structurally means. Government contracting shows this pattern in a particularly stark, well-documented way, because the entire process is designed around competitive bidding on projects with genuinely uncertain final costs. A contractor wins a large infrastructure bid by submitting the lowest estimate among a dozen competitors, each of whom was independently forecasting labor, materials, and timeline under real uncertainty about ground conditions, regulatory delays, and supply chains. The winning bid, structurally, tends to be the one that most underestimated the true eventual cost, which is exactly why so many large public projects run over budget in ways that look, from the outside, like mismanagement or bad faith, when a meaningful share of the overrun is simply the winner's curse expressing itself on a public balance sheet instead of a private one. The contractor didn't necessarily lie during the bidding process. They won specifically because their estimate was the most optimistic one in the room, and optimism under real uncertainty tends to get corrected by reality eventually, usually after the contract is already signed and the political and financial momentum makes backing out far more costly than absorbing the overrun. Think about what a room full of bidders actually represents mathematically. If everyone is estimating the same unknown true value, their guesses will cluster somewhere around that true value, some too high, some too low, roughly balanced out across the group. The company that wins isn't the company with the best information. It's the company whose guess happened to land furthest out on the optimistic tail of that whole distribution. Being the winner, structurally, means being the most wrong in the optimistic direction. Almost by definition, every single time the auction has real uncertainty baked into it. It's worth being precise about why this isn't simply a story about arrogance or poor judgment on the part of the winning bidder, because that's the easy, comfortable explanation, and it happens to be wrong. Imagine 100 perfectly competent, careful estimators, each independently studying the same uncertain asset, none of them reckless, none of them careless. Their estimates will still spread out across a range purely because the true value is genuinely unknown, and everyone is working from incomplete information. Averaging all 100 estimates together would likely land very close to the real value, which is the entire logic behind crowd wisdom methods used elsewhere in forecasting. But an auction doesn't average the estimates. It selects the single highest one and hands that person the prize. The wisdom of the crowd gets thrown away entirely, and what's left standing is whichever individual estimate drifted furthest from the group consensus in the optimistic direction. That's not a symptom of anyone being bad at their job. It's a mechanical consequence of how the selection process itself is built. The same pattern shows up in business constantly, far outside oil fields, in situations most managers never think to frame as an auction at all, even though that's exactly what they are. Companies bid against rivals for acquisitions, each side estimating the target company's future value under uncertainty. Recruiters compete for the same star candidate, each company estimating how much value that one person will actually create. Contractors compete for the same large contract, each one estimating how much the job will really cost to deliver well. In every one of these cases, whoever wins the bidding war is, by the exact same logic as the oil fields, the party who paid the most. And paying the most usually means overestimating the underlying value more aggressively than every other bidder in the room did. It also helps to notice what the winner's curse is not, because it gets confused with ordinary overpaying, and the two aren't quite the same failure. Ordinary overpaying happens when someone simply misjudges value, with no competition involved at all, out of bad information or poor analysis. The winner's curse is specifically about what competitive selection does, even to good analysis. Take a room of skilled, careful estimators, none of them foolish, none of them underinformed, and put them in a bidding process against each other under real uncertainty, and the process itself will still reliably select for the most optimistic number in the room. That's a structural feature of auctions, not a personal failing of whoever happens to win. Understanding that distinction matters because it changes the fix. You can't out-hire your way past the winner's curse by finding smarter bidders. Smarter bidders still produce a spread of estimates under real uncertainty, and the auction still only rewards whichever one lands furthest out on the optimistic end. The fix has to be structural, applied before the bidding starts, not a matter of getting better people into the room. Investors and deal analysts have flagged this exact trap in merger and acquisition activity for decades, and it tends to follow a very recognizable shape once you know to look for it. A board gets genuinely excited about a target company, maybe for good reasons at first. Real strategic fit, real synergy potential. Then a rival bidder enters the picture and raises the stakes, and something shifts in the room that has nothing to do with the target's actual value anymore. The competitive dynamic itself starts driving the price, not the underlying fundamentals. The winning price climbs past what the target company is realistically worth under any sober analysis. And by the time that becomes clear, the deal has enormous organizational momentum behind it. Nobody in the room wants to be the person who stands up and says the number has gotten irrational, especially after months of work have already gone into building the case for it. So the deal closes anyway, at the inflated price, and the winner's curse quietly does its damage over the following years, in write-downs and missed synergy targets that get explained away as execution problems rather than pricing problems. Managers fall into a smaller, faster-moving version of exactly this same trap constantly, often without ever hearing the term winner's curse at all. Picture a hiring manager who wants a specific candidate, someone 3 other companies also happen to want at the same moment. Each competing offer pushes the salary number higher, in real time, over the course of a week or 2. Nobody sits down and recalculates the role's actual value to the business at each new number. The number just keeps climbing, because the other bidders are still in the room. The winning offer, the one that finally gets a signature, can end up exceeding what that specific role realistically produces in value for the company, not because the candidate isn't talented, but because the price got set by the auction dynamic instead of by a clear-eyed estimate of worth. But here's the part that surprises most people once they actually sit with it. The winner's curse isn't really solved by getting smarter estimators into the room. Smarter estimators still guess. Guessing under real uncertainty always produces a spread of outcomes, and someone in that spread will always land on the optimistic tail, no matter how sophisticated their model is. Better analysis narrows the spread a little. It doesn't eliminate the structural fact that winning a competitive bid selects, mechanically, for whoever was most wrong in the expensive direction. You cannot out-analyze your way past a selection effect. You have to build a rule that catches it before the bidding momentum takes over the decision entirely. The fix isn't avoiding competition, and it isn't becoming a more cautious, more hesitant bidder across the board either. Plenty of competitive bids are worth winning at the right price. The actual fix is setting a maximum price before the bidding starts at all, based on your own independent valuation of the thing, not on the rising number currently sitting in the room. That number has to be locked in before the auction dynamic has a chance to quietly recalibrate what feels reasonable. Once other bidders are actively raising the stakes in real time, your sense of a normal price drifts along with theirs, almost without you noticing it happening, which is precisely why the ceiling needs to exist before that drift can even start. Sports front offices run into a strikingly similar dynamic every time 2 teams openly compete for the same free agent, in full view of the media, with the price climbing in real time as reporters narrate each counteroffer. Whichever franchise finally wins the signing has, almost by mathematical necessity, offered a contract that exceeds what the rest of the league collectively believed that player was worth, since every other team walked away at a lower number. Fans celebrate the signing as a win in the moment, and analysts spend the next several seasons writing about the contract as an albatross, because the auction dynamic set the price not a sober read of the player's expected production. The pattern is identical to the oil fields and the corporate acquisitions, just playing out on a stadium scoreboard instead of a balance sheet, with the same structural cause underneath every single time. Winning a competitive, uncertain bid selects for the most optimistic estimate in the room, not the most accurate one. Venture capital shows a version of the winner's curse that plays out over years instead of a single afternoon, which makes it even harder for anyone involved to notice at the time. When a promising startup raises a round with several firms competing to lead it, the valuation gets set by whichever firm is most optimistic about the company's future, not by the average of the market's actual collective judgment. That firm wins the deal precisely because it believed the most. And belief, in a competitive fundraising process, functions exactly like a bid. Some of those companies go on to justify the optimism spectacularly. Many don't. And the firms that lost those competitive rounds, the ones who walked away at a more conservative valuation, often quietly outperform on a portfolio basis over the long run. For the same structural reason, the losing oil drilling bidders in the 1950s often came out ahead of the winners once the wells were actually drilled. Real estate markets during a bidding war show the exact same curse compressed into a single afternoon. A house gets listed, several buyers fall in love with it independently, and each new bid resets what feels like a reasonable ceiling for the next buyer still standing. The eventual winner didn't necessarily value the house more accurately than the underbidders. They simply had the least resistance to letting the number keep climbing, often because the emotional momentum of almost winning had already taken over the decision well before the final bid went in. Ask that buyer 18 months later, once the emotional high of winning has faded completely, whether they'd pay that exact number again with a completely clear head, and a surprising number will admit they wouldn't, which is the winner's curse confirming itself in hindsight, long after the deal already closed. Professional sports drafts show a quieter, slower version of the same curse playing out over a career instead of a single contract negotiation. A team convinced it has found a generational talent will often trade away several future draft picks to move up and guarantee the selection, essentially outbidding every other team's willingness to gamble on that same uncertain prospect. When the prospect pans out, the trade gets remembered as bold foresight. When the prospect doesn't, and a meaningful share genuinely don't, the trade gets remembered as a cautionary tale, and either outcome was baked into the same underlying math from the moment the team decided to outwant every other franchise in the room. The team that wins the right to draft a particular uncertain prospect is, structurally, the team that was most confident relative to everyone else, evaluating the exact same incomplete information. What makes this trap so persistent, even among genuinely smart, experienced people, is that winning feels like validation in the exact moment it happens, when the feeling is least trustworthy. The scoreboard says you got the deal, the candidate, the house, the contract. Every social signal in the room reinforces that outcome as a victory. The actual verdict on whether it was a good decision doesn't arrive until much later, quietly, in a write-down, a resignation, a renovation budget that reveals what the excitement had conveniently obscured during the bidding itself. By the time the real verdict lands, the auction that produced it is long over, the champagne is long gone, and it's very easy to file the eventual disappointment under bad luck, instead of under a decision-making pattern that was entirely predictable from the very first competing bid. Here's the honest, slightly uncomfortable test worth applying after any competitive win, whether it's a hire, an acquisition, or a contract. If you wouldn't have paid that exact price without a rival actively pushing you toward it, you already lost, even though you technically got the deal. Winning the auction and winning the decision are not the same event, and treating them as the same thing is exactly how the curse gets its name. Set your walkaway number before anyone else is watching you decide. Write it down somewhere you can't quietly renegotiate with yourself later, and treat any move past that number as a loss on the scoreboard that matters, not as a win just because the other bidders dropped out first. There's a reason this particular trap keeps repeating even inside organizations that have been burned by it before, publicly, on the record. Knowing the winner's curse exists in the abstract doesn't feel like it applies in the specific moment a real bidding war is underway, because that specific deal always feels different. The target always feels genuinely exceptional this time. The competing bidder always feels like proof that other smart people see the same value you do. That last part is exactly backwards. A competing bidder isn't confirmation that the price is fair. A competing bidder is exactly the mechanism that pushes the price past fair in the first place. The presence of competition should trigger more discipline about the ceiling, not less, and yet it reliably produces the opposite reaction in almost every room where it happens. Follow along if you want more of these decision traps broken down the same practical way, because the next one covers the mirror image mistake most teams make when nobody is bidding against them at all.